Jason teaches courses in comparative religion and ecological humanities and in environmental ethics at Simon Fraser University. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jason.
All right, thanks. Let's get going. I have a lot of material, so I will blaze through it, and then we can come back to anything that folks want to discuss after I finish. But yeah, it's a real honor to be here and part of this group to have this conversation. And I notice people from all over North America, which is great. So let me get through some ideas and some information, and then we can open it up to questions and conversations. So I'm going to be talking a bit about my work with 4 monastic communities in the American West for my PhD, which then became a book. But I'm also trying to look at what I learned from studying the sense of place of Catholic monks about sustainable forestry with my own background in forestry and theology.
Hey,
So
Jason,
real quick, yeah.
Would you want to hit play to start the slide? Because you're...
Oh, this is how I present slides, actually.
My apologies.
Yeah, no
Thanks.
problem.
Okay.
It's kind of a quirk of mine. Like I kind of like seeing them in the corner there. And so this is just how I move through them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Maybe other folks noticed it and were wondering if he was gonna go presenter mode, but this is actually how I teach, so I'll just stick with this. So let me just quickly define monasticism and monks. Even though I'll be talking about primarily Catholic Christian monks, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and a couple other religious traditions have these what we would call consecrated monastic communities. So the words that we use, like monk and nun, come from Greek and Latin for either desert, eremo, or monachos, the solitary, or nonus, which is a mother in Latin. And these folks within a given religious tradition see themselves living a consecrated life. So they take vows that devote themselves to the religious and spiritual practices of that particular religion. And so monks often live in monasteries or some sort of cloistered or set apart landscape where they devote their lives to prayer. And within the Roman Catholic tradition, Saint Benedict is kind of a central figure. He was a 6th century monk who founded several monasteries and wrote a rule, so a regula, a rule for the monks to follow, which has become kind of the basis of Western monasticism. So when you hear the words like Benedictine, that's related to Saint Benedict. But reform movements like the Carthusians or the Camaldolese or the Cistercians are related to Benedictine monasticism, some of them emphasizing more of a hermetic kind of way of life. Technically, though, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians aren't actually monks. They're more friars or mendicants. So they are reform movements that saw themselves as being closer to the poor and more urban and less landed property. You can see on the right there, a friend of mine, a monk who passed away a few years ago from Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey, which I'll be talking about in a minute. So my first kind of real life encounter with a monastery was on a Yale School of Forestry European forest field trip, where we went to a Carthusian monastery, what are called charter houses in Slovenia. And this monastery has a long history, but basically founded in the 14th century, abandoned, and then refounded in the 19th century. It was attacked by the Ottomans and then the communists. So it has a long history of rebuilding, but they're surrounded by several thousand acres of forest, which is now managed by the state. And we went there mostly for the liqueurs, I think, but I kind of ducked off on a side trail and had a lovely moment with this cruciform ash tree that you can see in the middle. And it really started me on this path of thinking about the relationship between religion, spirituality, ecology, and in particular forestry. So that's how I got started with my dissertation project. And as part of that project, I did a little bit of historical background. So just to look at the way in which monastic institutions influence the forests of Europe. So today we tend to think of monasteries as, small retreat centers, but in the medieval monastic community, they were essentially embedded in the feudal landscape. So some monasteries had county-sized land holdings. So these were very large land holdings. And so they drew from these large land holdings to support their work in the monasteries. And George Dubé in the 1960s kind of hypothesized that the monastic communities were probably the kind of pioneers or frontiersmen of Europe, because they would establish a monastery in more or less wilderness, and then settlers would come and gather around those monasteries. And a lot of cities and villages were founded around monasteries in Europe and Russia, for example. And so he called it the Great Clearance, right? This first wave of deforestation in Europe that replaced the primary forests of Europe with agriculture and woodlands. But John Alberth kind of disagrees with this one-dimensional picture of monastics, and he says that because forests were such highly valued resources, even though some of the primary forests were felled, forest cover remained because forests were so highly valued. So we see a lot of early pre-modern forestry techniques developing around monasteries like pollarding and coppice, as well as non-timber forest products, the gathering of these products, fruits and nuts and semi-domesticated honey from bees, and especially sort of agro-silvopastoral systems where pigs and other domesticated animals were grazed. And so monasteries established themselves for the long haul. And so it makes sense that they would oversee and manage their landscapes in a more or less sustainable way, even if that doesn't look like a national park or a pristine wilderness. An example of that would be the Belgian double monastery of Stavelot Malmedy, which was founded somewhere in the 7th century by Saint Ramoclus. And in this abbey, we have a record of the wood products that are coming in and out of the abbey. And in just 1 year, there was 1,000 cords of wood, 2,000 cartloads of firewood, and 6,000 bundles of bark. So there's a lot of wood products that move through the monastic economy. And so it's in their interest to locate and to manage sustainably these forest resources. In Ellen Arnold's book, she talks about them not as exploiters or preservers, but as somewhere in between, right? She says, the monks were stewards of land and aggressive exploiters of resources, builders of agriculture and lovers of untamed nature, all at the same time. And this is something that I almost immediately noticed about monks and monasteries, is that they have this holistic approach to forests, forestry, and spirituality. As a kind of famous example, the Camaldoli Hermitage in northern Italy is a wonderful case of early modern forest practices that went on to influence the Italian forestry code that was fully codified in the 19th century, but we have publications of it starting in the 15th and 16th century. So the Camaldolese monks, who were more akin to hermits, they lived in their own individual hermitages rather than a big monastery cell complex. And they began managing this forest in the 11th century. So there's this very ancient history of managing for chestnut and for silver fir in this part of the world before we get Norway spruce and Douglas fir, which are now a big part of European and Italian forest. Today, I guess in the 1990s, wasn't until the 1990s that the Casentino National Park was officially declared. But the monastery complex and the villages around it are embedded in an 88,000 acre national park. So the Camaldoli monks who are still with us, their hermitage, and they have their hermitage is a really popular visit for tourists, and the village has a really popular retreat center. And I got to go there this summer. This is actually a picture that I took in June of 23. So it's a really beautiful place with this rich history of sustainable forestry, and as I say, mostly managing for chestnut and silver fir. So they began to develop the rudiments of sustained yield forestry. So marking timber, growing seedlings, and designing plots in order to predict the flow of timber into the monastery economy. Other Italian historians like Antonio Brunori have documented similar management strategies in just north of Venice, but that forest was primarily managed for the shipping industry rather than for the marketplace like it was in northern Italy. And others have looked to Italy and Camaldoli as an example of what's called a sacred natural site. So Giuseppe Maria Majarac and Gloria Pugnetti, they are European scholars who are looking across Europe at monasteries as the precursor to national parks, so sacred natural sites. You can see here on the left is a giant 800-year-old chestnut tree that's part of the Camaldoli Village park system that you can visit there. It's a beautiful place. And then on the right, you can see another monastery, the Vallombrosa Monastery Complex, which is actually Italian. The Italian patron saint of forestry isn't Romuald, who founded Camaldoli. It's actually Giovanni Gualberto, who became the patron saint of foresters and forestry. And this is a sacred beech tree, or at least the descendant of a sacred beech tree that was here, that is part of the hagiography of Saint Giovanni, where he was traveling in winter and this tree miraculously leafed out, and the tree was able to keep him warm in the cold winter. So the forests of Italy are cultural forests. They're deeply embedded in the history of Christianity in the region, and in the institutionalization of forestry throughout Europe. In a contemporary setting, Thomas Merton, who is a very famous spiritual writer from the 20th century, he became a Cistercian or Trappist monk in Kentucky at Gethsemane Abbey. And he's well known for his writings on contemplation, but for a while he was the abbey forester before he became the novice master. And in the late 1950s, he received a huge shipment of loblolly pines from the Extension Service of Kentucky. And he planted them with his novices, but most of them died in the first winter because they weren't very cold hardy. And so he had a very brief career as a forester, even though Gethsemane Abbey still has extensive forests, but they don't do a whole lot of silviculture there. It's mostly a landscape for retreatants, so a sort of a spiritual landscape. But Merton was also interested in becoming a fire lookout. He wrote letters to Rachel Carson and later joined the Wilderness Society. So he went from this more management for timber approach that the monastery had in the 1950s and really began to think about monasticism less as a working landscape and more as a sacred landscape. So he wrote for the Catholic Worker once. He says, "If the monk is a man whose whole life is built around a deeply religious appreciation of his call to wilderness and paradise, and thereby to a special kind of kinship with God's creatures in the new creation, then we might suggest that the monk, of all people, should be concerned with staying in the wilderness and helping to keep it a true wilderness and paradise. The monk should be anxious to preserve the wilderness in order to share it with those who need to come from the cities and remember what it is like to be under trees and to climb mountains. So, whereas the medieval monastic ethos was about sustained yield and sustainable management, in the 20th century, in the North American context, we can start to see that the monastic landscape becomes more and more associated with preservation, with sanctuary, with the spirituality of monasticism and the spirituality of forests and nature. For my dissertation, I was very lucky to visit 4 beautiful landscapes. So New Camaldoli Hermitage, founded by the monks of Camaldoli in Italy in the 1950s, New Clairvaux Abbey in the Central Valley of California, Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey in Carlton, Oregon, and Christ in the Desert Abbey, which is in Abiquiu, New Mexico. Each of these places has over 1,000 acres of land, and they do everything from grow walnuts to harvest timber to hazelnuts to fruitcake bakeries to running retreat centers. So they have a lot of different livelihoods. Guadalupe has the most forestry-oriented economy, and I'll talk about them in a second. But first, one of the things that I focused on in my research was how monks develop a sense of place. And the monastic sense of place begins with the vow of stability. So the Cistercians encourage their monks to become lovers of the place. And so a vow of stability means that a monk stays in a place. They stay with the monastery and the community. Whereas the later Franciscans would become mendicant. They would wander the landscape. The monks' call to holiness, it takes place in one particular community. During their periods of formation, monks spend a lot of time, not just in study, but also on the land. And so the landscape intertwines itself with the formation of the monk, and the place becomes a big part of the monk's discernment for how he or whether or not he or she wants to stay in that particular place. Every day the monk does basically the same thing, this liturgy of the hours that begins early in the morning and ends just after dark. They chant the Psalms in harmony with the rhythms of the day and with the season. So the symbolism of light and dark are very important in this liturgy of the hours. And then the symbolism of the seasons, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, of spring and summer and fall and winter, and the Paschal mystery of life, death, and resurrection. In the 20th century, monks worked the land. They have to be self-sufficient. So a lot of the monasteries in North America had farms. And before the 1960s, these were basically autonomous farms. But after a lot of the agricultural laws started shifting towards subsidizing commodities instead of farmers in the 1960s, a lot of the monasteries started to go or not be able to make a living. And so they began leasing their farmland and focusing on other industries. In addition, the populations of the monks has been getting older and recruits have been thinner. And so manual work has been harder to come by, and especially the kind that makes the monastery autonomous. So forestry began in the hands of the monks, for example, but now is managed by companies outside of it. But throughout all of these habits of stability, formation, liturgy, and work, a monk develops a deep attachment to the landscape, and the symbols of the Christian story and the experiences that they have on the land populate that sense of place and make it into a kind of sacred landscape for them. One of the monks at New Clairvaux Abbey said, "You become part of the land. Our vow of stability grounds us." And an image that was really helpful for me was the idea of these trees taking root. That was the image of stability that I had. The longer I stay here, the more I can see myself growing in ways I never thought possible. It's, of course, not always easy staying in one place, but the longer you can stay, the higher you can reach. So you can see this sycamore tree on the Sacramento River was a place of hermitage for some previous monks, and the land becomes an integral part of the monastic sense of place. Now, Guadalupe Abbey in Carlton, Oregon, is a beautiful place, and they have a long history of forestry on that landscape. So previously, they lived in New Mexico, and before that in New Hampshire. But in the 1950s, they purchased a property in Carlton that was subsequently logged. And so they moved onto the property and began grazing sheep mostly and planting wheat in the bottomlands and slowly beginning to reforest the land. There was a lot of Oregon white oak, a Quercus garryana, and in the 1960s, they in earnest began a forestry program. They experimented with some exotic species like the Leland cypress, but for the most part, planted Douglas fir. And now over 800 acres of the 1,300 acres are actively managed as forest land. So in the 1990s, the Abbey had kind of a paradigm shift. Before the 1990s, the monks themselves managed the forest, and according to sustained yield principles, it was much more of a even-aged plantation style planting and harvest. So the harvests were pretty big, right? 5 to 10 acres. Some of the monks got a little upset in the late 1980s about a clear cut that was near a really important picnic area. And so they began conversations about shifting this paradigm. So in the late 1990s, they hired Scott Ferguson of Trout Mountain Forestry. And since then, they've been diversifying the forest structure, the age classes. They've put some forest into a protective zone for kind of cultivated old growth structure forest, but they've continued to sustainably harvest by thinning a lot of these even-aged Douglas fir plantations. So in the first year, they did about first decade, they did about 1 million board feet, and then increased that, even though they're still well below the growth increment. And so they continue to harvest. Now they're really looking at the way that climate change is going to impact the growth of the Douglas fir trees. They've been helped out by a conservation easement that was purchased by Bonneville Power in 2010, and they're FSC certified. One of the really cool projects that Scott implemented was a restoration of some Quercus garryana savanna or woodland. And so they've been removing some invasive species and opening up some of these historic white oak trees to restore the grasslands, native grassland and Oregon white oak savanna. You can see a couple of images here that on the top of these much more opened oak landscapes that before were pretty crowded with Douglas fir, which was industry standard throughout most of the 20th century in Oregon. You can see on the map below that Guadalupe Abbey is a kind of a sanctuary for the county. So a lot of people come and hike here on the weekends. The conservation easement stipulates public access to most of the Abbey. And so you can see that they've installed a trail system. One of them is called the Guadalupe Loop, which, I think was a missed opportunity. They could have just called it the Guadalupe. But you can see that a lot of people really enjoy this landscape, and it's become a working forest, and a sanctuary. A lot of monasteries manage land in North America. I've cataloged over 150. Some of them have smaller landscapes, 1 to 5 acres, 10 acres, but some have extensive land, because when they established these monasteries in the mid-20th century, they needed a lot of land to sustain the community. So some famous abbeys would be Regina Laudis in Connecticut, which has about 450 acres of forest and farm. St. John's Abbey, which has about 1,400 acres of forest land and an arboretum, as well as a university. New Mellery Trappist Abbey has about 1,300 acres of mixed hardwood in Iowa. And St. Gertrude's Abbey, which has about 1,400 acres of mixed conifer forest and a lot of beautiful ponderosa pine in Idaho. So a couple of images from those monasteries. St. John's, you can see here from their website, the balance of hardwood and oak forest, about 1,200 acres, and conifer pine species, about 150 acres. At New Mellery Abbey, they have an organic farm, and they have hundreds of acres of forest. And one of their industries is a death care business, and so they have a carpentry shop where they make homemade urns and caskets for the funeral industry. And so that's a direct link between the monastery's forests, their monks, and their skills and these forest products. And so there's a lot of other examples, of course, but those are the ones that I wanted to highlight. Now, what is interesting is that the contemplative nature of monasteries has really shifted in focus from working landscapes to landscapes of contemplation, leisure, and spirituality. So one of the emerging trends that you've almost certainly heard of is Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. And this has become very popular in wellness communities because of some of the indications that engaging in 2 hours of forest walking per week can have a pretty positive influence on chronic illness, PTSD, blood pressure, stress, of course, and mood disorders, as well as increasing general feelings of well-being. I'm not sure we needed a fancy Japanese word to know that. The Western poets have a history of forest walking and strolling and Wordsworthian poetry, but this has become a very important conversation in management of landscapes for other than timber products. So the cultural or spiritual ecosystem services of forests. Another trend is what we might call the wild church network. Wild churches are communities of worshipers who are trying to hold liturgies outside in the forest. So up here in Vancouver-based Anglicans, the Solal and Cedar, and then in New Hampshire, the Church of the Woods. Stephen Blackamer is a fellow Yale School of Forestry graduate. Other programs like the Seminary of the Wild. A lot of these groups are focusing on the contemplative value of spending time in forested landscapes. So not just the well-being and kind of medical model or mental health model, but this sense that there's a sacramental value to forests, that you can have something of a sacred experience of the forests if we spend time in them alone or together. And so we're starting to see questions about how best to manage forests for contemplative practices. So this article just came out this week in Vancouver in the Vancouver Sun. They're doing a pilot project called Silent Trails, where they're testing out what management strategies we should include, what restrictions should be placed on trails that are oriented towards healing. So they're calling it Silent Trails. So I think a lot of this would be around restricting mountain bikes and dogs, for example, or music and maybe, I don't know if, I don't think they can regulate talking, but trying this idea of creating designated spaces within the forest, the regional park system for quiet meditative walking. And so the accessibility of these trails, includes level pathways, better mapping, um, disability access, bathrooms and facilities, and then managing nearby sources of noise and human-generated noise pollution. So naturalness and quietude. Now, I think that there's some questions to be asked about this approach to management, because it does seem, one, to sort of romanticize something that comes from another language like Shinrin-yoku. This was a practice it's not an ancient practice. It's actually from the 1980s, Shinrin-yoku from Japan. And we start to see it. It seems like it has its own kind of magic to it, other than how we might talk about it in English. So there's a kind of Eastern Orientalism or Romanticism there. In some cases, it's created opportunities to charge people money for training to become certified forest therapy guides, when really it's more of a question of access to trails and encouraging people to take time to spend time in forests rather than creating a paywall for the proper methods or techniques to do that. Another thing that this approach tends to do is dehistoricize or depoliticize the forest, so they become natural landscapes as opposed to richly cultured landscapes, because nature has a kind of primordial appeal. And then this orients them towards preservationist management, so hands-off approaches to management, which may threaten local community forest operations. And so that's my question to the broader community. We can talk about this, is whether or not contemplative practices are another way of shutting down active management, whether it's ecological restoration or thinning or whatever, or fire hazard or whatever it might be called for by local foresters. So briefly, to sort of sum up the direction I'm headed with this, is that I like this term contemplative forestry, but I want to make it clear what it's not, right? So what I learned from the monks is that they have this really rich history of influencing the techniques and institutionalization of sustained yield forestry in Europe. But in North America, much of their forestry expertise was coming from institutions like extension agents. So in a contemporary setting, you're more likely to hear about a monastery as a place of refuge or preservation or a sacred site. So they're being taken up as places of protection and spiritual and sacred nature. And that kind of plays into this either or approach, right? Either we're managing forests as plantations, or we're preserving wilderness. And I don't think any of the foresters in this digital room would agree with either an extreme version of either of those approaches. And so something that I think the monks teach and live is this balance between the oikonomia, the economy, and the oikos, the dwelling in these places. Ecology and economy have the same root word. And so there's a really important integral place-based approach to forestry that I see in the monastic landscape. And so if we're going to talk about a contemplative forestry, I think it's important to integrate the ways that we can connect ourselves to place, even if that includes some active management on behalf of the forest and on behalf of the communities that depend on these forests. And this image here is a picture of a hybrid, a London plane tree in my neighborhood. So it's a very old tree, but it is very close to my house. And it's something that I spend a lot of time with the trees in my neighborhood, My sense of place is very much connected to the trees, even the urban trees in my neighborhood. And so a contemplative approach to trees and forests and forestry is one that doesn't appeal to pristine wilderness or an idea of romantic nature, but of trees and forests that we have intimate relationships with, and on whose products and resources and species and ecological processes and ecosystem services that we all depend on. And with that, I will open it up for some conversation. This is just an image of the book. Again, mostly focused on monastic sense of place, but I do talk about trees and forests throughout.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah,
For those wanting to, well, first of all, that first of all, thank you. That was to coin a phrase or a term, that was enlightening. Sorry, I couldn't resist, but it was. And I
I'm
appreciate that
glad you
you
didn't
gave us that.
resist.
Sorry.
I'm glad you didn't resist.
I really appreciate that you gave that long history of monastic forestry. And in fact, I just put in the chat forum a link to your article in our magazine from
Yeah,
a couple issues ago, Forest History Today.
that's
That
great.
kind of encapsulates the kind of the first half of your presentation.
Great. That's good. Yeah, I forgot about that. I'm glad it's here with us.
And in fact, folks will recognize a few photos that you had taken and that you just shared in the presentation are also in this article.
Great.
Also, if you want to really dig deeper, a reminder that about Jason's book is available from Trinity University Press. And we'll have that information in the follow-up email that'll come out tomorrow. So to the questions from an
Yeah,
anonymous attendee, they're curious if you got to reside in any of the monasteries during your research and what was that like?
oh,
Or,
absolutely. Yeah, I got to stay for I stayed for a month at Guadalupe before they would even let me come back as a researcher. So I've spent a lot of time at Guadalupe before becoming a researcher and after. I love that place very much, and the monks there very much. And it's wonderful to be there. At Guadalupe, I participated in what's called a monastic life retreat, and so in that, it's a pretty strict kind of integration into the community. So I lived in one of the cells for a month, and I sang in the choir. I was participating as a monk, and that was a really powerful and exhausting experience. But in subsequent visits, you get to interact with a bit more as like a retreatant, right? So you stay in the retreatant quarters and you attend the services, but you're not in the actual choir or whatever. So, but it's really wonderful to. One of the things I notice is not having to drive anywhere is such a powerful kind of habit to get into. You're walking everywhere, between where you're staying and where you're going, and then the landscape is really beautiful. So you get to spend time in the landscape. So I recommend retreats at monasteries to everybody, even if you don't have a Catholic or even a religious approach to life. They're wonderful places to sit and think about your own life and your own questions, or even to get some writing done or some reading. So yeah, it's wonderful.
so would they not, um, my apologies, I'm having software issues. Would they not let you conduct research until you had gone through this process of spending a month there? What was their thinking behind that? Did they share that with you?
Well, yeah, they didn't know when I approached the abbot, he didn't know if it would work, if it would interrupt their lifestyle, and he didn't know me at all, and so
Mhm.
he just said, "Well, come and do this retreat, and then we can maybe imagine how it might go."
Well,
Um, Other monasteries were much more open about it. So New Clairville was like, yeah, come on down, you know. And so it just really kind of depends on the
Okay.
community or the abbot, and because there is this sense of they're trying to keep a buffer between themselves and the world a bit. So but
Okay.
since the 1960s, that buffer has gotten much thinner because in the Catholic Church, they went through a process called Vatican II, which was a whole modernizing of the liturgy into English. And then all the monastic communities were basically asked to rethink their approach to monasticism. And that was actually a time for a lot of rediscovery of the natural world and the relationship between monks and the land, for example.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Verna asks, this is a question about the forest-based religious services, or those outdoor services, the term of which it's flown out of my head.
Yeah, the
But she just
wild.
simply wants to know if they're conducted rain or shine, or, are they weather dependent, or is it, no matter the weather, folks are gonna
Yeah.
hold these
Well, if it's dangerous, they don't
services?
do it. If it's too windy, they wouldn't do it. But like in New Hampshire, for example, they hold services outside, I think 9 months of the year. But if it's really, really cold, they have a small like barn-like structure that they can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Another anonymous attendee asks, is contemplative forestry at risk of fire? And does that hasten the discussion between management and wildness?
Well, I don't know. I mean, contemplative forestry isn't at risk of anything. It's not a space, but forests are certainly at risk of fire. And my point is that a contemplative forestry needs to integrate active management. And by which I mean, this is someone else's question. By active management, I mean silvicultural um, techniques to manage the forest for particular stakeholder values, other than just leisure. So that was my concern about interpreting contemplative forestry as just forest spaces as places for healing and wellness, because then you start to see this as a kind of a pristine or kind of romanticized or eternal landscape rather than a place that we can call home, that we're part of, and that we're connected and involved with, right? And so fire as a risk is real. And if people get really hung up about keeping um, keeping cutting out of forests, then we're increasing fire risk. In Stanley Park in Vancouver, the park board has decided to cut thousands of western hemlock trees because of the looper moth that was so destructive in the last few years. We just had a devastating looper moth outbreak, which is a natural moth up here. And people are really upset to see them cutting trees in Stanley Park, which is it's a beautiful urban park with really old trees. Um, but the cutting of the hemlock trees is a really important step to not only to prevent future fires, but also I think in some ways to help some of the Western red cedar and Douglas fir trees to be resistant to drought because they're opening up some of the growing space for these other trees. So it doesn't, you know, we need foresters to interpret that and unpack that it's not a spoiling of some pristine landscape. It's a relationship that we have with the place, not this either or kind of mentality that you see in the media.
So it sounds like it's a microcosm of the larger
Yeah, yeah,
issue across at least the United States.
yeah.
Gary Schneider says, I'm curious as to how you define active management and what are the limits?
Yeah, I saw that question. I tried to answer it with that last one too.
I thought
Just
so
right,
too.
like, yeah, active.
Uh,
As opposed to passive, which is where you decide to do nothing or restrict interventions. It's still management. It's just passive, I guess. And,
mhm.
and maybe foresters in the room have other words for that, you know, but that's the way I tend to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Canham, who I know lives in upstate New York, says, I visited a monastery in Elmira, New York, about 60 years ago. He's curious if you happen to know if it's still there, but his question is, as you mentioned, the monks are getting older, and he asks, are any younger people entering monasteries in the United States?
Yeah. There are some, but it's not looking good. Like the whole population of North American monks is in pretty steep decline. There's a couple of pockets of what we call traditionalist Catholicism that are growing pretty quickly, but that's a really specific population. But on the whole, monastic communities are shrinking, and two Trappist monasteries have closed in the last decade in the United States. St. Benedict's in Snowmass, Colorado, and Our Lady of the Holy Trinity in Utah, which was actually one of the first monasteries that I went on retreat at after my trip to Slovenia.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So
so
they-
it's a diminishing kind of population demographically, but the number of retreatants that go to these monasteries has just exploded. So there's lots of people interested in these places, these landscapes. And so I think, and a lot of the monasteries are looking into conservation easements as a way of making sure that even if the monks dwindle, that the landscape and the legacy will be intact for a long time.
and someone asks, they're curious if you studied the forest sanctuaries around the churches in Ethiopia. They say, I was there a few years ago, and the only forest remaining seems to be around these churches. Are you familiar with this?
It's one of the coolest examples outside of North America, I think, of what I call the Christian forest tradition. And in there's a lot of people know about what's called the Buddhist forest tradition, where monks and hermits establish monasteries in the forest. But there's actually a pretty vibrant forest tradition in Christian contemplative uh, history, right? So hermits, not just these big abbeys that were part of feudal agricultural landscapes, but small hermitages, or what's what are called skeets. And then Ethiopia, basically, they're basically embodying the theology of paradise in the church. So the church becomes a sort of Garden of Eden, and ecologists have been able to reconstruct some of the historic ecologies of these landscapes because of Ethiopian forest churches. And Emergence magazine and Fred Banson, they have some really cool. There's a beautiful essay about the Ethiopian forest churches in a short documentary. So if you just search Ethiopian forest churches, Emergence magazine, you'll find that. So it's a beautiful documentary about that. So yeah, really cool stuff.
Um, Another anonymous attendee thanks you for this presentation and says there's just so many directions to go with this discussion. On that point, I certainly agree. But the question is, can you reflect more on the oikonomos and forests as living icons that advance our understanding and relationship with the Creator?
Mm,
Creator with a capital C.
yeah, between monasteries and the companies they hired to do the work. Wait, no, that's a different one. Wait,
Yeah.
where is this one? I want to read it again for myself.
Okay. So can you reflect more on the oikonomos
Oh yeah, there we go.
and forests as living icons that advance our understanding and relationship with the Creator?
Yeah, so this, it sounds like the person asking this question uses God language, so I'll speak to that language. But the monasteries see themselves as their whole lives are about seeking God or the Creator, and so the monastery landscape becomes a kind of an icon of God, of Creator. So there's not this transcendent. It's not that God is only transcendent, but God is infused with the land and the place. And so the experiences that the monks have on the land act as a kind of sacred text. So not only do they read scripture, but they also learn to read the landscape for the inspiration of this connection between themselves and the place and God. And so uh, in in a more, I guess you'd call it, Neoplatonist reading, the monks flee from the world and they focus only on God. So they would they would just be looking inward for God. So they would put, they would block out the windows and just be focused inward. And that was this kind of flight from the world. But since the 1960s, monasticism has really opened and been much more positive towards the natural world and this relationship between the immanent and the transcendent, the inscape, or the inner landscape, and the ecology.
Steve Ambrose, I'm going to help Steve out with this question. So his question is, any history of chestnut blight, which I think what he might mean, and Steve, feel free to weigh in, but let's, did the chestnut blight have an impact on monastic lands here in the United States? Or are there other threats, more, chestnut blight's a century ago, but the other invasive either diseases or insects, are these having an impact on monastic lands?
That's a good question. I think I would want to learn more about that. I don't know of any particular specific instances where chestnut blight in North America impacted a monastic economy. Mostly the ones I'm familiar with were out west, and those were established in the 1950s. So the blight had already ravaged the chestnut in the east. Though I'm sure there are monasteries that lost chestnuts in the east, but I'm not aware of those examples. The big one, I guess, right now is restoration and invasive species. So the hawthorn is a big one for the Guadalupe Abbey. Some of the invasive grasses, the bunch grasses in California, are a concern. And then, the big question right now in the West is climate change, right? So it's less pathogens and more about drought and water that are impacting. So they've already had to sort of pivot a little bit at Guadalupe for their rotations on Douglas fir, because they're starting to see the growth increment kind of plateau in some of the drier sites. So they're trying to think about what to do with that stuff. So.
Well, Elizabeth kind of has a follow-up question, conveniently. She asks, could you say a bit more about the relationship between monasteries and the companies they hire to do forestry work? And
yeah,
are there a few examples that you could offer?
Yeah, so Trout Mountain is the company that Guadalupe Abbey contracts with, and Scott Ferguson he's like 7 feet tall. He's a giant of a man, but he has a very monastic countenance, and so I think the monastery, took one look at him and said, "Yeah, we want to work with this guy." And so as the primary landholders, the monks are very, very, very particular about any kind of changes, right? They're very conservative, it turns out, monks. And so they had long conversations about what it was going to look like to transition their management. And so they have this very balanced ecological forestry approach. And that's because they have other industries that help with their income, and because of the big help from the conservation easement, they're able to do forestry so that it pays for itself, but it's primarily oriented towards the health of the landscape. So that's one example. That's my absolute best example of a sustainable forestry. But St. Gertrude's Abbey in Idaho has been working with the state to manage ponderosa pine forests on their 1,300 acres. And actually, we're doing a webinar once a month between now and August, where in August we're going to hear from the sister who has managed these ponderosa pine forests for a couple of decades. And so I think we have a link for that, if we could put that in the chat. But there's a webinar through St. Gertrude's Abbey where we're going to hear from the Sisters of St. Gertrude's about their forest management in August. So stay tuned for that. But a lot of these monasteries have really transitioned away from silviculture as a form of income. So a lot of the forestry that these monasteries are doing are oriented towards landscapes of retreats and contemplative landscapes, or fire prevention, or ecological restoration. So there's been a real shift since the 1990s.
This is a question I want to share because it's focused on outside the United States, but it may,
Sure.
it's on Nigeria. So, this is from a person who is a forest conservationist named Blessing, appropriately enough. And so Blessing says, "Hi, Jason, this practice that we've been discussing is common in Western monasteries. They've never seen this in Nigeria. As a Nigerian forest conservationist, where sacred forests are only with traditional worshipers, do you have thoughts on how they could reach this, how they could maybe engage with
Yeah.
monasteries in Nigeria?"
Blessing, I would love to be in touch with you and talk about the Nigerian context, because in Nigeria, there's such a different cultural context, especially with the tension between Islam and Christianity kind of competing to see who can be the more devout monotheistic religion. And both of those traditions have a lot of friction with the revival in traditional indigenous animistic ways of being. And so in the Western African context, animism and polytheism are more associated with the forest through their association with really particular gods, goddesses, and spirits and ancestors. And so a monastery in Nigeria might be very hesitant to use the language of sacredness and sacramental forests because of the association with these polytheistic worldviews. But it does not have to be either or. I think there's a really rich tradition of Christian sacredness to the natural world. And so it doesn't have to take on the character of a particular deity or spirit, but there's plenty of forests in Europe that are associated with saints, saints and the communion of the saints, and even seeing the forest itself as a kind of saint, trees as saints. Thomas Merton writes about that in New Seeds of Contemplation. So I would love to dialogue about how to bridge the gap between polytheistic sacred nature and a Christian approach to sacred nature. And a lot of the folks in the sacred natural sites community are doing this, right? The IUCN has done a lot of work with sacred natural sites. But this sounds like a really interesting conversation. Blessing, my email is in the chat if you want to grab it there. Jason_Brown_3 @sfu.ca. It's in the chat.
We'll also put it in the follow-up email, as well as a link to this recording. Somebody else asked if this would be available for review because they want to really think more deeply about these concepts, which that's a comment I greatly appreciate. Mac McClure asks for your thoughts regarding the monastic relationship with the land as compared to that of native people's relation with the earth.
Yeah. Well, in North America, everybody, including monks, has a lot to learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters about a relationship to place. But indigenous spirituality is, if I can speak generally, more commonly animistic. So it sees particular species as cultural persons that they have relationships and responsibilities and reciprocity with. Whereas I think Christianity is very much behind in that conversation, because Christianity has been captured by Enlightenment thinking that privileges the human as the only kind of personhood out there. And so we have a lot of, I think, repentance to do in the Christian community about understanding the natural world as personified in personhood. And there's plenty of ways to do that, like I mentioned, through the communion of the saints in Christianity. And so I think Christianity, especially, in Canada, we've been talking about residential schools. So we have a lot of public penance and repentance to do in relation to Indigenous communities. And another one of the talks in the webinar series is going to highlight the work of an organization called Land Justice Futures. And Land Justice Futures are partnering with monastic communities that might be closing down because there's too few monks or sisters. And they're working with those communities to find ways to do reconciliation, or to give the land back to Indigenous communities, or to find ways that communities of color could participate in those landscapes or farm. So they're crafting things like cultural conservation easements. So there's a lot of conversation that can be happening right now about how the traditional territories where these monasteries are located could better integrate Indigenous conversations, which it doesn't have to just be about, rights and title, the legal ownership of the land. There's a lot of ways that these monastic communities can make right with the Indigenous communities whose traditional territories they've been worshiping on for several decades. So yeah, lots of conversation to be had here. But actually, when I was at Guadalupe last year, we had some representatives from I think it's the Grand Ronde community. So it's all of the Federation of Kalapuyan peoples in Oregon. We had several folks from that tribe come to the monastery to look at how they're doing oak savanna restoration. So the Abbey is now consulting with tribes in Oregon on how to restore oak savanna, which, as most people know, is an anthropogenic ecosystem, right? You need fire to maintain oak savannas, and especially here in British Columbia where it's so wet. It was the Indigenous people that kept Oregon, or what we call Gary oak, or what I call Cascadia oak. We kept them around through burning, because if Indigenous people hadn't been burning, Douglas fir would have overtopped them, right? They're the climax species in that drier ecosystem, that forest ecosystem. And so they're anthropogenic ecosystems, and a lot of tribes up and down the Pacific coast are trying to find ways to reintegrate Oregon white oak, Quercus garryana, into their cultural landscapes. And Guadalupe Abbey has been integral in that conversation. So yeah, lots of cool conversations happening with Indigenous people, and they're in many ways leading the way.
Sean, out of Virginia Beach, Virginia, notes that with the great decline of monks, I mean, he asks, I'll alter his question to ask you, you mentioned a couple of the monasteries had closed. And so what Sean is basically asking is, what has become of those lands? Were they sold off, abandoned? Well, and going forward, what are some possibilities? You mentioned conservation easements, but
yeah, that's been the big tool. The Our Lady of the Holy Trinity, which was in northern Utah. I'm blanking on the name of that city, but anyways, they were able to secure a conservation easement through a private donor. So a private donor basically bought the property, and then the Utah State Valley University land planners helped raise the funds to buy the development rights. And so that property is in private hands, but it's under a conservation easement. So it's become a kind of a cultural landscape as part of this broader landscape. And it's a beautiful place. And then St. Benedict in Colorado, they're closing, but I'm not sure what they're going to do with their property. I have not heard yet. But conservation easements are in place on several of the monasteries in the Trappist order, for example, New York and North Carolina, for example. Some of them do green burial, conservation burial grounds. There's lots of different ways that monastery landscapes are being protected. And as I mentioned, this Land Justice Futures is an organization that's trying to work with monastic communities to talk about the legacy of their landscapes.
And so these easements and other legal structures would outlast the population of the monastery?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There's no monks living at the Utah monastery. They live in a care home in near Salt Lake City.
And those groups will carry on the management of the landscapes,
Yeah,
correct? Okay.
exactly.
Conservation easement is not my bailiwick. Last question, and I love that we're going to go out on another on a global question. This person asks, are there examples of this dynamic playing out in South America or even Australia? The monastic
I don't know.
landscapes.
I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know. Yeah,
Did we just give you a new area of
yeah.
research?
I know there's a couple of monastic communities in Australia, but I don't know of them. I've never been to Australia. And the Latin American context is fairly different as well. So, but it's a really interesting question. I'd love to learn more about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be your next book, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I would really like to document more of the land held by monastic communities. There's actually another organization called, I think it's called Good Lands, but this is a woman who created a GIS project to map all of the Catholic Church's land holdings.
Hmm.
Her name's Molly something or other. Let me look it up.
Okay. And before
Yeah,
we,
Molly Burhans is the founder of Good Lands. It's in the chat, but they're basically, she's mapping all of the Vatican or the Catholic Church's property. And so that's, I think, a cool start to that conversation about conservation.
Mhm.
And then I think an additional question is the justice question, right, around reconciliation, but I'm not sure they're quite there yet. So,
well, Jason, thank you again.
yeah, thank you.